Okay, so today I'm sitting here with Michael O'Brien. He's a barrister specialising in employment law, and we work with business owners day in and day out. And I really wanted to engage Michael to help us understand employers' obligations and employees' rights, and both in return at this time. So, Michael, the first question I wanted to kick into with you, business owners are facing a reduced income for an unspecified amount of time. What if an employer wants to reduce either the number of hours or drop their employees' income down to 80%? What do they need to be doing?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is an employer needs to be aware of its contractual obligations to employees. And it's well known that an employer can't unilaterally make changes to an employment agreement, an employment contract. Therefore, you are relying on the employer's consent. Some employers in their employment agreements may have what's known as a force majeure clause, effectively an act of God or an act of an event outside the control of the parties. So I think the first port of call is for an employer to check the employment agreement to see what relief that potentially provides. Failing that, I think it's important that an employer realises they can't unilaterally just go ahead and change an employee's agreement. They can propose it and seek to have employees agree to, potentially on a temporary basis to sort of navigate, I guess, the current difficulties a lot of employers will be experiencing. But those employers who just go and unilaterally do face the risk that arrangement could effectively be undone, and they'll still be liable, for example, the full amount of hours that they should have provided or the full salary.
Okay. And what about when an employer insists or wants to insist that an employee uses their annual leave at this time?
An employer under statute, after it's tried to agree the timing of an employee taking leave, can direct an employee to do so on 14 days notice. Again, it's important to check the employment agreement, and that may provide the employer needs to give a longer notice period. The other thing to be aware of too is in the context of the government COVID-19 wage subsidy. That's effectively a relief arrangement from the government to an employer, subject to the employer having made certain declarations. Now, receipt of that subsidy doesn't in any way, shape or form change an employer's contractual obligations with an employee. That's a separate discussion because you've got an employer, you've got an arrangement between the employer and the government, you've got a separate arrangement between an employer and an employee. Receiving the subsidy doesn't somehow give the employer the right to pay employees at, for example, 80% of their normal pay.
Okay.
There needs to be a separate process worked through.
Okay. Oh, that's a very, very interesting point. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And so going back to your notice, one of the things is holiday pay will always be a liability on the employer's books. So, there is an advantage potentially for an employer to seek to bring down that amount during this time of potential inactivity by the employee. But again, need to check the employment agreements, but the Holidays Act provides for 14 days notice to direct. Again, an employee may agree to take leave without a direction needing to be made.
Okay. So an employer's gone through this process and they now realise that they're having trouble keeping that boat floating. And anecdotally, I'm hearing about redundancies where some people are saying, well, that person's the weakest link, so I'll fire them first, or, that person was last on, so first off. But that's not the appropriate process to be taking at this time, isn't it? If a business owner is looking at redundancies, what do they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, well, it's a reality. A lot of employers will be needing to think about redundancy. The law does recognise the concept of managerial prerogative, that employers do have the ability to best manage the business and, where necessary, to save costs and make changes to reduce, for example, the overall wage or salary cost. An employer does need to be careful, though. You mentioned the weakest link. Redundancy can't be used as a quasi or roundabout way of performance in managing an employee. So an employer is on shaky grounds if they take that approach. The last on, first off. Some older agreements do provide for that. But even before you get to that point, an employer would need to go through putting a proposal to employees about a restructuring change. If that's going to involve which employees would be selected if the proposal was adopted, the employer also needs to properly consult on the criteria for that selection. So, for example, an employer who was going to use or proposing to use the last on, first off would need to consult with that as part of the wider discussion around the restructure. Again, the fact that, you know, the country's currently in lockdown and employers are navigating, for a lot of them, which will be an immediate drop in revenue, doesn't give them a free pass not to comply with employment obligations. So proper consultation around redundancy, giving employees relevant information, just not making general references to sort of financial impact, being quite clear with information and going through that consultation process. Now, it's a reality in the current environment that face-to-face meetings can't really happen. So that needs to sort of be managed through sort of telephone conferences or video conferences. But again, those basic things of, you know, setting out the proposal, letting the employee know that they can bring a representative or a support person who, again, will participate in the phone or video conference. All those things are really important to manage properly.
And what are the risks of getting it wrong?
Well, look, the risks of getting it wrong, if we take a unilateral reduction in salary, so you start paying someone at 80% or 60%, the risk there is that the employer brings a claim and says, well, you have to back pay me for the 20%. And you know, the employer then hasn't achieved their goal at all. And there's potential compensatory payments for the distress the employee might have suffered if it's affected their ability to pay the mortgage or the like. There could be those sort of flow-on claims for remedies. In terms of redundancy, the risk that the redundancy is undone, or at least found to be unjustified, which is going to further increase sort of costs. So I think the point is it's an important front-end investment for an employer to get it right. These are difficult times to sort of navigate. Things are changing, but I think it's important an employer acts, I guess, rationally and carefully in dealing with its employees, does so fairly and in line with the obligations of good faith to really minimise that something's going to come back to bite the employer later on and cause further financial hardship.
So what tools are available to employers to support them through this decision making and as you say, this uncharted territory that they're working through?
Yeah, look, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment on the employment section of their website does have some tips for employers around different sort of processes and some supporting documents available. It's always that old adage that you often do need to tailor it for the situation, tailor it for your business and the situation you're dealing with. But I think, using those supports, obviously, where an employer can, taking advice, having someone help guide them through the process, and again, not rushing it or doing things unilaterally. And I think an employer realising if they do that out of expediency or for whatever reason, that does carry with it a risk.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience and insights with us, and particularly for those small business owners who are already feeling pretty overwhelmed with all the things they need to be dealing with at this time. Making the information really easy to understand is hugely appreciated. Thank you, Michael.
Look, all good, and I really do appreciate it. It's a really difficult time for everyone involved in these situations. Is often uncharted territories, and any huge amount of stress will be sort of on people. So, yeah, all good. So thanks for having me, Gemma.
Thank you, Michael.